All right, everybody, man, this one's gonna be rough. I just finished The School of Night by Karl Knausgaard, translated by Martin Aitken, and when I say rough, I don't mean because the book is bad. I mean rough in the sense that, man, there's so many thoughts that I have about this book that to do this. I mean, this would be the first, I think, time that I've ever done a review where it's my first time reading a book by like a Knausgaard or a Murakami, a book that I finish, and I'm just left with so many sort of thoughts that really like. There's just so many that I don't know how to focus them. They're just so scattershot. So I'm gonna do my best here to try and talk about this like a sane person. So here we go. The School of Night, what brought me to it, obviously I like the other books in the series, and one of the things that I mentioned, and I don't know if this counts as pros and cons, I'm kind of going to be a bit scattershot this review, in my the Third Realm review, was that the Third Realm was frustrating because it suffered from middle entry syndrome, where themes and stories are continued but not really concluded, and it just kind of leaves it hanging, and I didn't like that. So I'm very happy to say that the School of Night returns to being is very standalone. In fact, the connections to the broader series, aside from a thematic focus on death, are it's very self-contained, and those broader connections are subtle to the point where if you never knew this was a part of a series, that would be fine. And to a certain extent, that also kind of works against the... Well, no. It's even written in a different style. I mean, I've talked in my previous reviews about one of the things that I think Knausgaard is good at is making a character's voice feel unique. And this book is very different amongst his other works in the sense that it follows only one character throughout the entirety of its 500 pages, which even The Wolves of Eternity, which I appreciated for having much more of a focus on Sivert and Alvetina, I don't remember her name. Anyway, so for the School of Night to be one character is definitely something, it's a huge plus for me in the sense that I tend to prefer books that have a stronger focus on one character rather than going for a broader image. I kind of, yeah, at the point of being redundant. So, but the other side of it is, in terms of, while it is nice for me that it focuses on one character, this book lacks a lot of these sort of philosophical, not tangents. That's what I'm looking for. I wanted to say diatribes, but diatribe is totally not the right word. These sort of philosophical tangents that I think really defined the earlier books and that I really enjoyed, in favor of having a much stronger focus on plot. This being definitely very self-contained, very standalone, and not being part of a larger structure means that it has to have that beginning, middle, and end. And while I'm very satisfied that it has a beginning, middle, and end, I do feel like certain things end up not coming across quite as well as they could or as they should as a consequence of that. But anyway, getting into to whom would I recommend this book? If you're interested in Knausgaard, then I don't think that you should just start with The Morning Star. There's no reason not to. Like, yes, this book stands alone, but I think you'll be better off with just starting at the beginning, and I think it'll give you more of a broader appreciation going into things. But if you think that the plot sounds interesting on its own, and you're particularly interested in Faustian tales, then go ahead and try this. There's nothing, like I said, in the broader context that I think you'll miss out on. So moving into the pros and the cons. Like I said, I already mentioned, for me, it's a pro having one character, having that singular focus. You've got a beginning, middle, end this time. And it's more of a pro in terms of the writing, but it can be a con depending on the person you are. But in terms of what I've been talking about Knausgaard and unlikable protagonists, and I have to take a moment to say I have been like on a streak of unlikable protagonists. It's weird. This is definitely the least likable protagonist of the past few books that I've been reading, and that's saying something because I read South of the Border, West of the Sun, and I hated that guy. But here, the main character Christian is such an asshole, such a selfish, self-focused piece of shit that nothing that happens in the book ever changes him, and in a way, it's you could argue that it's sort of a con in the sense that the character doesn't develop much, but I think that's sort of the point that Knausgaard is going for here. Like, he is such a selfish piece of shit, but in terms of the prose, like I said, and everything else that I've talked about with Knausgaard, you really understand why he's a piece of shit. And early on, personally, I felt sympathetic for him because as a creator, I have been in his position before in the sense that I have had people praise my writing, tell me that my writing is very good. I remember the first short story I shared in a public place. We were sharing 2 short stories in creative writing class at college, and the girl that went before me ended up crying over the criticism that her book received, and then, or not her book, her short story, and then mine went up and everybody was positive, and I can say that I definitely stroked my ego substantially, and I developed ego from not just that event, but from all the positive works that has since made some unlearning of that ego extremely brutal in the times to come. So in that sense, I empathize with the main character in the sense that his family situation is, on the one hand, it's not bad, but on the other hand, it's clear to me that he's kind of lived in the shadow of his siblings. His father, early on in the story, he overhears his father calling him an outright narcissist, and this ends up being the reason that he never contacts his parents again. So I understand, kind of where he's selfish, where the selfishness comes from. And even I think to create art involves a certain amount of ego, because there is so much art in the world that in order to believe that you have something to say that nobody else has said before, or that you can say it in such a unique way that it justifies its own existence in the sheer sea of content that we have today. And I don't even mean content in terms of like slop. Like I want to not mean slop, but in terms of even art, like quality art. There's so much of it stretching back to the, to when text was invented, the Iliad and the Greeks, all the start with the Greek stuff. In order to stand up and say, no, I have something worth contributing, that requires ego, regardless. And so a certain amount of ego in an artist is to be expected. But to then, he takes it so far, and again, every chance for him to be humbled, he just completely ignores. So he's a piece of shit, but the pro is, again, it would be so easy for another person to take this character and make him irredeemable, but maybe it's just because I personally empathize too much or what, but I understand his situation. And I understood him early on. Like I said, the first 120 pages, I was kind of hoping that things would go well for him. Of course, I know Faust. I know how this is going to go. I'm not, under any illusions or anything like that. But I was kind of hoping that he might develop and grow and whatnot. So, but as it goes on, he just continues to be a piece of shit. So, good job at making what most writers would turn into a character that I couldn't stand into someone that I continued reading throughout the whole book, and who continued to kind of engage and propel through the book, if only to ultimately see his downfall. In terms of a con, to counterbalance that, again, I mentioned the lack of sort of philosophical meanderings or thoughts that go on in this book, and in a way, it is present. But a lot of it, because the sort of protagonist is a photographer and he becomes sort of known for his photography of death, which death, as I've said, is the overall theme of the whole series. We can't see his pictures. We can't see what he's talking about when he says, like, there's a certain vibrancy, a certain pull to his art that resembles something about death or something about time. All we're getting are descriptions of these things. And in a way, it's like art experienced vicariously, but it doesn't quite work. It's like when somebody sort of describes to you why a certain song is really interesting or fascinating, but they're not doing it in a technical sense. In technical sense, you might be able to understand it, but when you're trying to describe the emotions of the song, and you're trying to say, like, okay, at this part, it takes sort of the themes and the motifs and then repeats them softly, but then it's gradually swelling and swelling and swelling, and then this instrument comes in and it acts as a companion piece to this, and the two harmonize together, and it raises the overall melody to a higher standard. Like, that description is not doing justice to actually listening to the music. So in that sense, the fact that a lot, I feel, of the sort of thematic depth comes from the photographs that the character is taking and what those photographs capture and mean. Yes, on the one hand, it's still there, and I would expect a sort of level of reflection to it that would come in text. On the other hand, absent of seeing these photographs ourselves, ultimately it comes back to a sort of show don't tell thing, where we're just being sort of told that this is what's captured in the image, and that in and of itself is sort of the thing that we're meant to reflect on. But absent seeing the image ourselves or being able to listen ourselves, we're not able to fully appreciate or understand that thing. And to give an example, they mention the first photograph ever. They call it. It's in a. I don't know if it's the first photograph ever taken, but it's a daguerreograph. Hold on a minute. Okay, a daguerreotype. One of the earliest ones of a street in Paris. And because if you know anything about cameras, exposure time is the amount of time where light is directly hitting the lens. The lens is open. So in the older days, you needed a lot more exposure in order for the image, because all pictures are just light, to imprint on the paper. What this means, though, is that things which move won't be captured in the image because it's open for so long, because, again, it's a very, very slow process. So you have this daguerreotype of Paris, and even though it would have been a very busy street, there's a figure, a shadowy figure in the image still, and the reason is that it's a person getting his shoe shined. And they talk about this image in the book, but it wasn't until I went and looked it up myself that I really began to appreciate what they were talking about, the sort of haunting image of seeing what should be a busy, crowded street completely and utterly empty. So this is kind of what I mean in the sense of you can describe a picture in the book and kind of describe what it is you want to draw the reader's attention to, but it's a completely different world to be able to see the image, the picture, and then be able to yourself interpret and feel those emotions that they're talking about in the story. And I do appreciate that, if you want to do a story about a photographer, or you want to do a story about a musician, that this is going to be one of the inherent limitations going on about it. But the thing with this book is that being a photographer is kind of secondary to the thematic depth of an artist and an artist's relationship with their work, and an artist's relationship to death. So while I, would call it a pro in the sense that I enjoyed a lot of the background on photography and like this very interesting photo, in terms of a con, I just can't help but wonder, even though I understand, like, okay, doing it about writing or something, or poetry, I don't know, would be a lot more trite, it still would have at least been a better, I think, way of conveying the theme than necessarily making it about a photographer, because so much of the sort of conversation thematically I feel is lost by being rendered through this medium that we can't appreciate because we're being told a description of a thing rather than being able to see the thing itself. Back to the prose of the book. I like the way that it handles the Faustian tale. I obviously earlier in this channel I mentioned or I reviewed Dr. Faustus. I've read The Angel's Game, which is also very Faustian. There's Faust itself. I haven't seen the Christopher Marlowe play, but I very much would like to after this. So I'm no stranger to the Faustian gamble here, or gambit, or whatever you want to call it. So it was really nice then to be able to read a story where I know most of the major beats, but I still appreciate the way that it sort of executed it, the way that really for the most part you could see it as more of a metaphorical gamble rather than a literal one right up until the very end. So cool. I'm glad that you can take a story that I know that you're aware about, that you can even then talk about within the story itself and still come away from it not feeling entirely derivative. But again, and this is where I would come in on kind of a con, where it is still ultimately a Faustian tale. It is offset a lot by... It reminds me also a lot of Crime and Punishment, where, as is the case in most of these types of stories, the character commits a crime, and this is sort of part of the Faustian gambit, where he spends a lot of that time sort of thinking about it, but there's also a lot of talk of superior humans, and that the superior artist shouldn't have to bow low to the sort of norm of humanity, that he should be above humanity via his artistic notions, is what he can provide to culture. So very Dostoevsky, very Crime and Punishment in that sense. And I think that kind of helps balance out the, again, like Faustian overtones, where it's not just Faust, it's got a lot of other elements in there too. Finally, lastly, the big con that I want to touch on, and the thing that really bothers me the most and sticks the most on my mind coming away from this, is like in The Wolves of Eternity, the story is going along. You have part one and part two, following, 1986, 1985? 85, London, and then into 86, London, where the main character, Christian, is a 20-year-old, and what ends up happening is at the end of part two, there's a huge time skip to part three. Now, lest you think that these parts are evenly distributed, for the last 100 or so pages of the book, so the first 400 thereabouts pages are, well, okay, not 400, about 350, 360, 370 thereabouts are 20-year-old Christian. Then the story skips ahead. The thing is, the point at which it skips reminds me way too much of The Wolves of Eternity, with both Sivert and Alevtina, where both those characters were right on the cusp of big changes in their life. Their life was kind of in the transitory stage, where they had acknowledged that things weren't working out where they were, and they were ready to make changes, and in the very first process of making changes, and then hard cut. And then it's many, many years later, and we're kind of going back and filling in the blanks. In The Wolves of Eternity, it didn't bother me as much, because I think you spent so much time with Sivert by that point that you sort of understood what made him tick, and yeah, it was kind of annoying, but you also, again, it's part of a larger story, so you kind of give it that leeway. It wouldn't be entirely satisfactory on its own, but at the same time, I didn't necessarily think that there was a whole lot about Sivert's life beyond that really was necessary to sort of understanding his thematic arc as a character, his going from a sort of coming back with nothing to his name to becoming sort of a self-made man. The same with Alevtina, how she sort of ties into the larger story. Her personal plot is not necessarily as important as her thematic contribution to the story. Come to the School of Night, where, as I said, this one stands alone very much, which is great, but when we hit that hard cut point, it leaves a lot of things on the table. And then we come back 22 years later, right at the point, like literally that a few days after we start it, where it's the tipping point, the inevitable tipping point in all these Faustian tales where things start to collapse. And the thing is, like, I don't necessarily know, as a writer, how to address this, because it's easy to say, like, okay, well, I wanted more to fill in that gap. I wanted to understand what happened. The book should have been longer. It should have been 800 pages like The Wolves of Eternity to really go back in and fill in all the details. At the same time, there were moments, and this is where I noticed that didn't really say a pro of this book was the pacing, which for the first is kind of a first for me with Knausgaard books, where there were moments where the book kind of dragged and it felt almost annoying, and they were the moments mostly where we got to the depths of some of what I found annoying with Crime and Punishment, where Christian is just constantly doubting himself. I'm going to go to the police station and confess my crimes. Only I'll do it tomorrow. Only I'll do it tomorrow. Only I don't need to do it. Only now I need to do it. Only what do they know? Blah, blah, blah. Like, just so much time inside the character's head where you just want to scream, oh my God, just get on with it. Do it or don't. Just move the plot along, move the theme along, do something. Because the cycling the drain is just starting to piss me off. So in that sense, like, do I want more writing? No. Do I want, do I necessarily need the details of Christian's, rise to fame and all the stuff that he did between now and then? Not necessarily, but it just feels a little bit too abrupt to sort of cut in, to sort of take this character, established where we are, spending 75% of the book to get him to a certain point, and then to pick up with that character 22 years later, 24 years later, however many years later, 2 decades later, and now to the character, he has other things that are important to his life, other people that he all has a history with that we've never met, and all the people that he had a history with when we left him are pretty much gone from the image and not really brought up. So it's so jarring that I don't know if it could have been just written in a different way and not have required more words, if certain parts earlier could have been cut and added later. The thing with writing is that there's so many different ways that you could have addressed this problem that I don't want to sit here and say that, oh, it needed more. It's just there's this problem, this disconnect from where the character was when we left him to where we picked up, that feels like such a huge gap that something really needed to be there to kind of bridge that easier, because as it stands, it's just too much. And not only is it too much, because it's something that I've seen with the Wolves of Eternity, where it worked, it was okay in the Wolves of Eternity. I wasn't like super huge on it, but it didn't, drag it down a whole lot to me either. Here, it just is a drag on the whole thing, and I'm kind of starting to worry that it might be something that Knausgaard kind of falls into, which would not, be sad to me, because it's just, once or twice is okay, but if this is all you do, then it starts to feel like you can't kind of do that middle part and bridge that gap all the way as it needs to be. And okay, so I've talked a bit about the pros and the cons. Before I get into the analyses of the themes, I mentioned as an addendum to my Third Realm video, the name The Third Realm, and how it felt a bit lame that it didn't really tie or it be explored in the book in much in the same way that the Morning Star did in the Morning Star, or the Wolves of Eternity, the quote, how it tied into these sort of themes present in the Wolves of Eternity. The third realm, they mentioned the third realm, but they didn't really explain it or tie it into the book very well. Well, here we've got the School of Night, which the School of Night is, according to Wikipedia, it's a modern phrase, which I don't know about that. I have never heard of it before. But it refers to a group of individuals that, again, according to Wikipedia, were originally called the School of Atheism in Europe, or not Europe, in England, who were all sort of writers in the Elizabethan era who spoke against what was at the time the sort of Christian view. So, obviously with the School of Atheism. It doesn't necessarily seem like they were, together as a group. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But the primary thing is that in terms of relationships with sort of God and, Christopher Marlowe was a member of this group, and Christopher Marlowe is a huge influence and thing on the story as it goes. I think that aspect of the book ties in pretty well. So going on into the analysis of the book, and this is where I'll just go full spoilers. It's so weird because there's simultaneously a lot to take away and not much to take away, because I feel like there's a lot to this book, but I also don't feel the same depth to it that I did in the other books. It sort of got breadth but not depth to any individual topic. So, like, when speaking of atheism and religion, it can't be overlooked. Usually I don't put much focus on character names and the origins of those names and how they might be thematically relevant. Not because I don't think it doesn't matter. In fact, I think a lot of times it does, and authors do put consideration into what they name their characters. But sometimes I also think that they don't, and it just ends up happening. But this is one of those cases where you're telling a tale about Faust, and you have named your character quite literally Christian, a name which the origin of the name is to be a Christian, a follower of Christ. So that's so on the nose that you can't ignore it. At the same time, Hans, who is meant to be sort of the stand-in for Mephistopheles, is the name Hans means God is gracious, which it's Germanic, again tying it back to Goethe and Faust. So in that sense, like, the names are interesting because you have Christian and you have God is gracious, but at the same time, this is the person who refutes Christ, and this is ostensibly the person who is the stand-in for the devil. I don't necessarily know that, or Mephistopheles, who works for the devil, as is sort of the case with the broader Morning Star mythos. It's not dead-on Christianity. It mentions at the end of part 1 that Hans stares back and opens his mouth 3 times like a fish, which is a callback to the entity that is stalking Tove in the third realm does the same gesture. So clearly there's a connection there. So I don't know if this is necessarily Mephistopheles, in that sense, or if this is just kind of a broader metaphor, or if this is, again, something that'll go on and be explained later on. I don't think that in terms of the thematic analysis, it's really that important. But, the idea God is gracious, and we never know, for people who haven't read the book, what ends up happening is on his way to a girl that he is sleeping with, Christian runs into a homeless person. He gives the homeless person some cigarettes, and in order to light them, he doesn't want to get close to the homeless person, so he tosses the lighter to the homeless person, who lights a cigarette and pockets the lighter. And rather than return it, when Christian asks for it back, he goes, I don't know what you're talking about. And so Christian moves forward to take the lighter away from him. He resists. Christian kind of pushes him up against a wall. His head hits the wall. Christian takes his lighter, walks away. Turns out later on that the man's head hit the wall, the homeless man, and he died. This sort of incident follows Christian all the way through, and eventually he gets picked up by, this sort of leads to, like I said, the should I go to the police? Should I not? Well, I didn't really do anything. Well, they don't know anything. The Raskolnikov sort of mental trap, I guess, situation. And in the end, the cops end up coming to him. He's about ready to get hooked for it. He calls Hans because Hans is the only person he knows. And Hans ends up coming to his rescue, and somebody else quotes confesses for the crime. And so he's allowed to go free. And this is where, again, I come back to, and, in my pros and cons, I try to keep light spoilers, but I'll just talk about two big cons that I have with the book here, because it is in full spoilers. We never fully understand who it is that says that they actually killed the person, which to me, I think thematically, it's not so much from a plot point, because I tend to be more interested in themes. I like plot. I like having a plot that goes with it, but even thematically, we never quite fully understand the nature of the gamble at play. And when I mentioned that, I think one of the things that I liked was the fact that, obviously, again, the opening and closing his mouth is a dead giveaway that it's something supernatural. But other than that, you could read the story until the very finale and see it as just an incredibly lucky break. But I don't know, because we never understand, like, okay, somebody came forward and confessed. Well, we know that we have no reason not to believe that Christian is responsible for the death. You could assume that somebody came after and then killed the guy or something, but that would put it more into mystery thriller territory. And it never goes that route, and it never says anything to the contrary. So we never really understand. We understand what's at stake for Christian in terms of getting arrested, but we never fully understand what it is that he sort of gambled in the process, because we never know, like, who was the innocent person who went away to jail. Was there an innocent person, or is this just Hans being some sort of magical entity who can control and manipulate people? We don't know, but I certainly think it would sort of lend a completely, or rather an even heavier air about his behavior if an innocent person was in jail for a crime that he not only committed, but was so petrified and selfish about that he wasn't able to step forward, because ultimately what happened was an accident. I can't imagine that he would have suffered too horribly for it, given the way that it went down, which, I think that adds to his character, the fact that it was an accident. It wasn't a big deal. Well, I shouldn't say it wasn't a big deal. Someone died, but in the sense that there was no malicious harm, and he was wronged first, and was trying to get his lighter back, and things just kind of got out of hand, and he didn't even hit the guy. To my understanding of it, he kind of put his hand under his throat and shoved his head back and grabbed the lighter from his pocket, and his head just happened to hit a wall in such a way that he died. It was a shitty situation, but had he come forward, who knows how it could have gone. I'm not a legal expert, leastwise in English law, but I think if he'd come forward, there would have been a lot of leeway given to his situation. But instead, again, he was so selfish and put it off. And again, all those points matter thematically, because they help us understand his character, understand who he is. Again, he talks about how artists should be graded on a scale in terms of how much they have to conform to society, which, goes hand in hand with Raskolnikov's great man theory. So in that sense, you've got that element to it that's an important thematic element to the book, but by not having and seeing what sacrifice he made, we're not fully able to appreciate, or there's not an extra layer of depth that could have been added. And my second big con that I'm going to mention here in the spoilers and analysis section is the sheer absurdity with which he lets slip his potential murder. Because again, this ties back again to what I was saying about the sort of gap between spaces and how it really undermines this particular book. I can understand what Knausgaard... Okay, I think I understand what Knausgaard was going for. I think the idea is that he's been sort of talking and going on his whole life, avoiding about it, but he finally sort of is so big that it slips out. The sort of significance of what he's done slips his mind that anybody would still care, and he says it. The fundamental problem is that there's the way that we leave him, and this ties back into what I was saying earlier, like the way that we leave him at the end of the second act. This is the most important thing in his life. And then when we rejoin him in the the third part of the book, the fact that he would let it slip so flippantly is just beyond absurd. It's completely insane. So the idea that we as readers needed more understanding to understand where his headspace was at, beyond just he's an egotistical prick, because he is an egotistical prick, but even egotistical pricks usually have a better sense of self-preservation about them than to just go blithely admitting on live television that that when they were in their 20s they probably accidentally murdered somebody. And then his response to it is meant to sort of signal, again, that arrogance, but again, not sort of understanding where he was to where he is now. It comes across as extraordinarily flippant. Again, we spent how many pages of him just tormented over the idea of this getting out, that for him as an adult to just randomly throw it out there, to be able to see visibly that it's harming him, but to then just be like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter. I can see a world where that happens, where he develops into that type of person, but we aren't, for my 2 cents, given enough to fully sort of appreciate that development, and it creates this sort of huge gap in the themes, especially when it comes to sort of his own actions coming back to bite him. I think it's handled much better in the way that his son ends up dying when he's sort of checking his phone, and the whole reason he's checking his phone in the first place is because a girl that he slept with while he was in this gallery in New York, this exhibition, has decided to confront his wife about it, which, again, that's something that gets brought up and then goes nowhere. And I understand that, the death of your child would obviously be the most important thing in your life. But as you're processing the death of your child, the fact that he's such a person. Let me paint the scene a little bit. He gets a text from his wife asking who this woman is while he's out with his son. And it's obvious that he loves his son, but it's also obvious that he can be inattentive towards his son. And so he's on his phone trying to formulate a reply as he crosses the street. The light changes when he's at the halfway point, so he stops at the island in the center of the street, realizes he left his son on the other side, turns around, sees his son start running out into the street, and his son gets hit by a car. So in that sense, the text distracted him. The text that never would have happened if he'd never slept with a woman, blah, 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 blah. So, in the grief, I can't imagine, him being the self-defensive person that he is, not blaming Sanja is her name, or Sonia, for this tragedy, or for the wife to blame him for saying, had you never slept with that woman or whatever. So I can see it, but at the same time, it feels like a missed opportunity. But I do think it executes on that idea of his past coming back to haunt him pretty well, even if I do kind of question his son pretty much existing mostly as something for him to lose. And even then, whether or not his son is lost in part of the bargain is something... Faustian bargain, that's the word I was looking for. Not gamble, not gabbit, bargain. Jesus. Anyway, it's something I like about the book and I appreciate about the book, because he is just such a piece of shit that it would be very easy to just say, well, this is your fault, man, utterly and completely, and the devil or Hans or whoever had nothing to do with it. So, I don't know. But going back to the analysis, I mentioned atheism, I mentioned the names, and yet it's not a huge deal, because even though he is named Christian, even though we are talking about the devil, he never really struggles with Christianity or his beliefs, because he's such a selfish piece of shit that it doesn't really matter. We don't really get a whole lot. It's not like he's going to be questioning his faith or anything, because he never had any to begin with, which comes back to what I mean. It's there. These elements are there thematically, but they don't really go anywhere. At the same time, you have artistry and what it means to be an artist. And I like the idea, that, sort of what changes him is this incident, is this encounter. It's the thing that takes his art to the next level, because what's really changed is he's been exposed to something that before he had a naivete about him, and that in being exposed to this death and being exposed to this incident, to this tragedy and whatnot, he sort of evolves as an artist, because he sees life in a different way. And part of art is making other people see the world the way you do. So I like that angle. I like that it's explored, and I like that it's never really said like, oh, I killed this guy and then I was able to see things differently. He's completely ignorant of the fact that this had such a big impact on his work and on his art. He kind of briefly acknowledges that some of the things associated with the murder took on a new meaning, but he doesn't directly connect it to what he calls, sort of the next level in skill. And again, coming back to competitive gaming, what he says about plateauing and climbing, and plateauing and climbing, whether it's gaming, whether it's education, this is a thing that I've heard time and time again, so I believe in it wholeheartedly. But again, not recognizing that event as significant to his development. Again, I appreciate the subtext, or the subtlety, the way that it's handled, and I like the idea that you need this kind of counterforce to understand, art in order to make good art, and the idea that, stare into the darkness and the darkness stares back or whatever. But I also think that there needed to be an alternative to that, to sort of give the other side and the counter argument, because, unless what Knausgaard is saying, and I don't think this is the case, is that all great art requires, some kind of great suffering, some kind of great sacrifice, some kind of inherent evil. And I don't think that's the case at all. Suffering, maybe, I don't know. I'll leave that up to the individual to decide. But this is what I mean when I say, like, it's got that element there, but without the counterpoint to it, it feels like it doesn't go anywhere near as far as it should. And to kind of build on that, again, sort of bringing up another con. I'm bringing up all the cons in the analysis part of the book. But this is where I feel having other characters, not necessarily viewpoint characters. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that we needed a second viewpoint to provide that contrast. But what we needed was more of the side characters to be developed to provide that counterpoint. This is something that Murakami does in his work, in the sense that, like Wind Up Bird Chronicle, you don't just see the themes from the main character's point of view. You see these sort of themes of death and life and whatnot through other characters as well. So Lieutenant Mamiya, Mei Kasahara, Kreito Kano, you see the same themes of the book expressed differently, even though you have the one main character, and it really lies in having side characters that are well developed enough to express those themes. And you kind of start to have this in the first 20 pages of the book, or not the first 20, the first two parts of the book, with Vivian, with Daniela, with the Egyptian man whose name I forgot, who's not even Egyptian, with Hans even, these sort of differing perspectives and approaches and takes on art. But again, because the story is so focused on Christian and his development, those characters, not only do they not sort of develop as much or, come off feeling, as accessories to his story, which I don't necessarily mind, but the problem is that they don't provide reflections of the themes that Christian is going through, or sometimes they do, but we don't quite get enough of them to appreciate it. Like Vivian feels like the perfect counter example, and yet not only does she dump Christian, understandably, I don't have a problem with that, but she, again, at the end of part 2, nobody is brought up from the previous 2 parts aside from Hans, and like a light reference here and there. So let's see Vivian, who does theater work, and her approach to art. She's said to be very, very talented, to the point where they, even as an adult, run across each other once or twice. Let's take Daniela or some of these other characters, and not just sort of throw them by the wayside in between the 2 parts, but have them serve as contrasts to Christian, so that we can see that maybe there are other ways to finding good art, other ways to fame than necessarily this Faustian bargain. And that's really what this book is missing, I feel, overall, is just counterpoints to the stuff that it brings up, to really sort of dig in deep and understand the themes that it's talking about. Because when I talk about the great thing about first person being the fact that everything is filtered through that character's perspective, meaning that everything consequently of the story is meant to be subjective and meant to be questioned. But the problem with sort of a book like this is that it brings up so many themes, but it doesn't bring up the tools vis-a-vis the sort of characters to really question sort of the main character, or sort of interrogate beyond our own personal feelings the sort of rightness or wrongness about Christian. It kind of brings up this broader question of what makes good art and what is necessary to make good art, but it really only gives us Christian's view and our own view. And I would have preferred, more interrogation into that, more interrogation into the question of, religion and atheism and the devil, more interrogation into the questions of history and places and, things like that. I very much appreciate, especially coming off of like Swallows, where, the book, is, as you'll see in my show Don't Tell, Knausgaard lets this character be a bastard, lets us form our own opinions about it, lets us find our own feelings. So I'm not saying that I want him to tell us what to think, but even in his previous work, he embodied much better the idea of having multiple views that could then, sort of bring about a different way of looking at things. Even with Seivert in The Wolves of Eternity, he had a much smaller crew. It was mostly just his mother and Jor, or is it Yor? I don't know. But the way that they contrasted against his behavior was constantly refreshing, because it constantly, caused you to, each interaction sort of cast him in a new light. Like, yes, Jor is sort of inclusive, and Seivert is very extroverted, introverted and extroverted. They're contrasts in that sense. So Seivert's concern for Jor is understandable, in the sense that Jor maybe could do with a bit more getting out, but at the same time, he's so strong about it that he ends up being overbearing and counterintuitively, sort of right thing for the wrong reasons. And that's just a sort of simple example of the dynamic between the two, in the way that it sort of sheds light on both of their characters. In The School of Night, the other characters are not developed enough or not present enough for you to really get that sense between them. And that's why there are a lot of similarities between Seivert and Christian, I think. But the differences are really in the absence of other characters to call them out on their weak points, but also to in the sort of self-analysis where Seivert will back down or something, despite being very arrogant, very selfish, and does, he believes in what he believes, but like when his wife will tell him something, he'll listen, versus Christian, who just is single-mindedly, doggedly determined. So, they are separate characters, they are distinct, but I wish there was more. And that's what I come away with from this book, really, is just the sense that it's good. I like it. I will read it again, and I want to read it again, because I feel like there is a lot there. But at the same time, the sense that I get from it is that it's lacking a sort of focus. I don't know if it needed to be longer. I have no problem with long books, or if it just needed to be written differently. Again, there are just multiple ways it could have been done. But for all the reasons that I've brought up in this 50-minute ramble, it's not doing it for me. It's not connecting. I would still say that it's, I would still say I like it better than The Third Realm. It's difficult because The Third Realm has the writing and the prose and everything and the philosophy that I like from the series, but this has the beginning, middle, and end that I like from, just reading. So in that sense, I still think, it's not the worst book in the series by far, but had it been the same book but written to the same feeling, the same prose, the same standard as the other, it has so much potential to have been the best book in the series. Let's say it was 800 pages, but it had all these, side characters that reflected and delved and pushed the themes deeper, and we better understood Christian and how he got from A to B, and it didn't have this sort of huge gap. That there's so much potential for this to be something, so great, but instead we're just kind of left with what it is. And that's really when I talked at the start about this being rough. Expectation is always a dangerous thing. It could be that I come back to this appreciating it more for what it is later on. Certainly that's happened with, I mentioned, South of the Border, West of the Sun. That happened to me with Hear the Wind Sing. I appreciated much more on a reread. I have had it happen where when I approach books, going into them, the other Murakami book that I read recently, End of the World and Hardboiled Wonderland, where I approach them with so much expectation and they don't meet that expectation, and then I come back and read them again and find that they're nowhere near as bad as I remember. So everything I've said here could end up just being a case of my expectations not aligning with what the book is, and then I'll read it again, and turns out, this is actually great after all. I don't know. Only time will tell, and all I can really do are give my thoughts on the book as I feel now. But as I said in my mission statement, the really important thing is that for me, the first time I read a book, it's not a hard review. It's more a first impressions, because for me, the process of going back, of rereading things, understanding what it is, trying to meet it where it's at, and appreciating what it's trying to do is such a huge part of the process. So if you're really looking forward to this book, which it's weird that I'd say this now at the end when I spoiled absolutely everything about it, don't let that get you down. You never know. You may enjoy it more than I did. So see you next time. I will be reading Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red next. So looking forward to it.